I was raised quite a religious child growing up in Jamaica, which is where I was born and raised. And then I decided, at some point that the idea of God didn't make sense. So I became an intransigent atheist for about 25 years, one of those evangelical atheists. And it just wasn't working for me. And I started praying to God to undo the atheism and realize that need was not belief. But I never gave up. I just started praying for grace and had a conversion experience and gave my life to the Lord about 4 years ago. And it so happened that this book, Letters to God from a Former Atheist, that is forthcoming. I had been trying to find a publisher for it for a long time, but I never felt that it was ready because it was written in a state of belief, agnosticism, back to atheism, trying to find belief, but not believing. And when I finally found a publisher, a very good publisher, I returned to Letters to God and I started writing more letters to God and prayers. And the idea of sharing with God, it sounds ridiculous, sharing with God my abuse, when God knew all along what happened. But I sort of confronted God with this thing that had happened to me when I was about 5 or 6 years old. And I felt a great unburdening of my soul in the presence of God as I was writing those letters to him. And I decided that shame and secrecy secrecy really is the root of shame. And so I decided I would write an article and really come out as a closeted Christian, because not many people know that I am now a Christian. And at the same time, I thought that, I started rethinking the whole phenomenon of this notion of being born gay, and really thinking about my molestation, which I had never shared with anyone, not even my mother. She doesn't even know to this day. I had been in psychotherapy for 6 years, and I had never told my therapist about it. I had been in a relationship with someone for 14 years and never told that person about it. And but because it just organically came up in the letters to God, I began to think about possibly, various phenomena that could be causally traceable to something called a homosexual orientation. And under the guidance and under the tutelage of God, I began to piece together the relationships with my parents and this molestation that I think, in my case at least, if not caused, contributed greatly to my sexual orientation.
Yeah. And so how old were you when this molestation happened? Were you 5, I think?
5 going on 6, yes. It was a staff member. It was my grandfather had a huge estate. That was his retirement gift to himself. And he was like a big farm by the seaside. And there were lots of we call them field hands, who worked there and in charge of the pigs and the goats and running the estate. And it was one of those boys, or men rather, who did it. So it was a staff member. And I sort of I didn't block it from memory. I remembered it in detail. But I felt like I was not worthy of telling anyone about what had happened, because there was so much shame and secrecy. As I wrote in the article, 2 years later or a year and a half later, I put a plastic bag over my head because I was so desperately unhappy and traumatized by what had happened to me. And so subsequently, in the ensuing years, I just kept it out of my mind. I didn't repress it. I just trivialized the significance of it in my life.
It's interesting you say that, because in my book, I talk about that. I was molested as well. I think I was 8 or 9. I don't remember exactly, but and living as a gay man up until 15 years ago, when I got saved and became a Christian, I never wanted that dark and terrible night to be associated with my sexuality. So I always dismissed it as, that wasn't a big deal. And I actually was in therapy for 5 years. Before I was a Christian, I was in therapy. And And I never once mentioned to my therapist that I was molested until I think it was like the last day of therapy. I said, "Oh, by the way, I was molested," and he just like gave me this look like, "Why haven't you told me this from the beginning?" But yeah, so I understand that, and I also was uh silent about it. I didn't, I confided in one friend of mine who was my age when I was a kid. I told him about it, but I didn't tell anyone else about it because of the stigma. I was worried about the stigma. If it got out, like people would see me differently, and my school classmates would see me, as some damaged goods. And so I understand that. So and then you talk about another thing, a second memory from your childhood.
That's the memory of my mom crying, and I think me sort of comforting her and putting my arms around her.
And why was she
And
crying?
um, well, my parents were living in New York at the time. We were what should have been a 3-year separation. They had migrated in 1968, and they were supposed to have been gone for 4 weeks. And my father developed schizophrenia, or was showing signs of schizophrenia, and it turned into a 4-year separation where we saw our parents twice a week, twice a year rather. So I think she was crying because she missed her children. We had gone up to New York to see her that Christmas, and to see the family, my father and my mother, that Christmas. And I think she was crying because she was terribly unhappy with my father, with the marriage.
Mm.
She didn't know it was schizophrenia. The pharmacology at the time, I think, was quite primitive in diagnosing or treating, if not diagnosing, treating schizophrenia. And I had the feeling after comforting her, and this is a pattern that developed afterwards, that I was the only person in the world who could bring her solace. I
Yes.
was the only person in the world who, I was told later on by my grandmother and my mother that whenever I appeared in a room, life seemed as if it were about to break out into a musical. And nobody knew the sort of very sad, melancholic, somber, secretly depressed child that I was. But I put on this magical, upbeat persona to sort of illuminate the lives of my mother and my grandmother, but primarily my mother. And embedded in my mind was the idea that if I left my mother in any emotional way, if I abstracted my life from her in an emotional way, that she would actually die.
Mm. I had the same experience. We have such
Wow.
similar experiences. Because my mother, I was the youngest of 8 kids, and my father was super busy. He was a lawyer. He was always busy and didn't really give my mother kind of the attention she needed or wanted. So that was my job. And I felt for my whole life, really, I felt like a surrogate husband to my mother. And I felt
Yes.
like it was my responsibility. Her well-being was my responsibility. And I
Yes.
felt that way up until she died in 2016. But so I know what that is like. And you talk about, we'll get to this in 1 second, but my father, again, my parents were great, as they did the best they could. But my father, because I was the youngest of 8 kids, he had zero time to interact with me, to play with me, to hold me, uh, to say, I'm proud of you, I love you. Like, there was none of that from him. So I had like this kind of sort of non-relationship with my father, and then a very unhealthy, neurotic relationship with my mother. So I understand that. But your father suddenly repudiated you and your brother when you were 12 years old. Why did that come about?
Well, this was at the height, I think, of his schizophrenia taking its ascendancy in his life and really seizing his mind. Before, he had been extraordinarily close to me. We had a really amazing bond, but it was never sustained. I mean, after my parents' divorce, he'd be around for a couple of weeks and take us to the beach and take us to places where regular parents would take their children. And then he'd be gone for 5 months, and then he'd come back. Then he sort of had this, what he called a conversion experience. And he found that serving the Lord and being a parent, being a father to his children, we're not speaking financially, because he was never able to financially support us. My mother was an accountant in a bank, and so she was a single mother with 2 children. But he was not able to be a father in any way, because he said he had to be a father to the nation, and he had to be a father to the world, really, by spreading the gospel. And so this repudiation and this denouncement really came about because of an incompatibility that he found between being a parent and serving God. And so it was quite dramatic. I mean, he actually did genuflect. People think, I mean, this sounds like fiction, but he did get on his knee and said, I love you, but I love Christ more. Loves you tremendously, shows physical love, and then retracts it, disappears from the world for 5 months, comes back, shows you that love again, and then leaves. So there's a sort of unpredictability in his behavior, coupled with a mother who is fragile but strong at the same time, and in whom I feel a deep loyalty and an alliance with. And I had the feeling that if I really loved another woman, this is very important, Becket, that if I did love another woman, it would be a betrayal of my mother.
Wow.
So I thought all these phenomena cannot be just cast aside. They have to have some sort of causal effect or efficacy vis-a-vis them and my sexual orientation. And I still felt this void. And I just realized one day I cannot. I knew intellectually that it would take God to fill that void. But when you have unplugged yourself from the source of your life, it's like when you plug your computer out of its socket, the computer is going to die if it's not recharged. I had plugged myself away from God, the life source, everyone's life source. And I had been living on that energy, that life source, and I was becoming depleted. And in my depletion, I realized that intellectually I had to find a way out of my atheism. So I remember going to Croatia and buying a crucifix this size and carrying it in my pocket. I remember engaging in certain rituals like saying the rosary, because I was raised Catholic, and still being an atheist, like going into churches and just find myself viscerally feeling emotional and lighting devotive candles while still being an atheist. These were all ways in which I was trying to somehow get beyond my own limited ability, because I knew that the intellect was not the way to God. I mean, I'm a philosopher. I've taught proofs for the existence of God and proofs against the existence of God, and so on. I knew it would take something else. But I knew that this void and this sort of aching hollowness, in spite of all the accoutrements of success that I had acquired, was not going away. And something had to give. And something did give. I was granted grace. Because
I'm just laughing because our stories are so similar.
I know I read
crazy.
your book, and it did. I read your book when it first came out, and I heard this said again in church, and it's like a force from behind me just pushed me from the bench into the what is that little thing that you kneel on?
Yeah, the kneeler, I guess it's called.
The kneeler pushed me onto the kneeler, and I got zapped. I was like, I get it. And I said, okay, Lord, I'd always had a problem with the second Trinity, the divinity of Christ. God the Father, God the Holy Ghost, I could make sense of, but God the Son, I'd always struggled with. I just remember saying, okay, God the Son, I give my life to you. I don't really know you, but I've got a lifetime to discover you and to understand you. But this is my life. Take it and do with it as you will. And may your will in all matters prevail in my life and supersede my egoic desires. I said that right in the church, and
Wow.
it's been a continuous adventure. I mean, I had tried converting to Judaism back in 2016 out of desperation because I thought I have to find a way back to God. So maybe if I become a converted Jew, my grandmother's father was a Jew, and um, so I've got Jewish ancestry. I thought maybe if I become a converted Jew, it didn't work. I went through a year, and that just when they're about to sort of dunk you in, I said, no, 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 no. My roots are in Christianity. So I was really desperate um, to believe in God again. And so when that happened in 2019, my life just completely changed.